In part 3 of the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa's identity completely dissolves. He becomes more and more estranged and alienated from his family, from his entire world at this point. His family is his world. The dramatic ending of part 2, where his parents, in a kind of paroxysm of passion, thrust him back away from them, begins in part 3. It picks up on a much different note. There's a sense of real contrast going on here from moment to moment, it seems, where Gregor is a little irritated that he's being ignored so much. He'll peek out of his little room and he'll see his family, watch the entire family sitting at the brightly lit table and listen to their conversations now, as it were, in an officially sanctioned capacity, and thus quite differently than before. So they're just blocking him out. They're ignoring him. And he's feeling a little put out. He feels like, he's being barely tolerated in what used to be his home, the home that he pays for, after all. The family is showing some signs of financial independence, of getting back on their feet after the trauma 5 years before of the father's business going under, and they all became semi-invalids, or at least the parents did. And but they're getting their act together a little. They're becoming more assertive, more independent. The mother is taking in sewing. She's working as a seamstress, primarily, significantly, would be sewing ladies' underthings for a dress shop. She's always associated with this strange female sexuality. There's always some little note of, remember, she was very undressed at the end of part 2. She has this weird association with sex, quite frankly. The sister is studying stenography, and she's taking a job as a sales girl. So she is getting on a ground floor job and already looking to work her way up, it would seem, into something perhaps more secretarial. I guess that's a ranking, I assume. And she is showing some signs of, career ambitions. She is showing some signs of independence. The father, of course, is also now employed. He had a job he got a job basically in part 2. He's working as a porter. He has a sharp uniform, and his demeanor at the end of part 2 is suddenly much more commanding and respectful and dignified. And you're starting to get a sense of, okay, he is the man of the house again, if you can use that phrase. Clearly, there are 3 breadwinners now, and maybe none of them are making as much as Gregor did. Gregor was actually quite a good breadwinner. But they're becoming more financially productive. They're becoming more independent. They don't need him as much anymore, and Gregor, seems to feel that, and it hurts his feelings a little. He seems to have lost his entire identity as the breadwinner in the family. He seems to have lost his entire role in the universe. But he's still just there. He's a giant bug, but he's still there. And the physical the physical reality of his situation is starting to really take a toll as well. The apple that his father beamed him with in the back at the end of part 2 has become lodged in his back and is essentially starting to rot and become infected. And he is living in filth. His sister barely cleans up for him anymore, just doesn't really, tosses some food in there, takes it out without really noticing later on that he hasn't touched it. He hasn't eaten in days. His treatment is very cold, let's say. And he seems to resent this. He resents, most of all, I get the sense, his dependency on them. He cannot do anything for himself, and they are forced to do everything for him, which is the exact situation that his parents found themselves in when he, Gregor, became the breadwinner of the family. And so there is this weird psychological dynamic going on. And again, this is before the language of Freud really took hold in the world of art. And so Kafka is articulating a dynamic within families that is perhaps very familiar as children grow up and parents get older and these things happen, but also is unspecific and doesn't have the convenient facility of a discipline like psychology to allow us to deal with it objectively. But you get the sense throughout this passage that frustration is really building on both sides. Gregor is just frustrated with his parents and frustrated with his situation, although he never really questions the being a bug thing. That just, he just sort of accepts that and moves on. But he's frustrated with the feeling of dependence and the way his family seems to be overlooking him or even, ignoring him, resenting him. And there's frustration, it seems, on the family's side. They're like irritated that they have this bug around. It's a point of some shame, and it's just a point of why do we have to deal with this? This becomes somewhat more acute when they take another step towards financial independence and they invite in lodgers, young men who are going to come and live in their apartment, which is, again, fairly large, especially for a family in financial straits. But they invite in some young men who, rent a room and board, and they're going to pay a certain amount every month, supposedly, and this is going to help support the family. A lot of people do this. But the lodgers themselves seem a little smarmy, seem a little they don't seem like good guys. It's an intrusion into the house. It's an intrusion into the home. It is an indignity, because then the family, who would be, lords and ladies of the castle, let's say, becomes servants. And that is a weird dynamic, not unlike the reverse dynamic of breadwinner and dependent between parent and children. When you take in somebody that you are suddenly supposed to be serving all the time in your own home, that's a psychological shift and another infraction on your dignity. And it's especially a problem because there's that one room that they want to keep the lodgers out of, and they don't want anybody knowing about. So Gregor becomes, at least within his room, especially even at the beginning of part 3, it says that he could just The parents didn't even seem to care that he was looking out of his room at them as they're having dinner. Now they don't seem to, I would guess, want him to open the door at all. That's no. And you can see why. Tenants of any form will object to bugs being in their home, but if it's a bug that is that large, several feet long, that's a problem. And who could really blame them for being upset about that? But you get this very somewhat disturbing scene when they notice and take a little interest in Greta, the sister. She starts to practice her piano, and they say, "Oh," or not piano, her violin, and they say, "Oh, hey, we would love to hear a little music." They don't seem like real connoisseurs of the arts, let's say. No, not aficionados of music necessarily. And, well, the parents, "Oh, yes, certainly, absolutely. Come on, sirs, come on in here. Take the good chair. Let's set Greta up in front of you." And they go and they actually stand behind her, leering and looming over her, let's say. And they're obviously they're perving on her, and they don't really care about the music. And once she starts to play, it becomes even more obvious that, well, they get a little bored, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's great, you're good," and they start to look over and gather among themselves and talk. They say, in hushed undertones to one another, like, "Oh God, what is this? Do we have to sit through this?" And it's a little funny. But Gregor, at this moment, Gregor hears the music from his room, and excuse me, he is drawn. He cannot help himself. He is drawn out of his room to go and seek out his sister. He knows his sister is playing, and remember, he's been planning to send his sister to a music school, to a conservatory. He loves his sister, and he loves the music, and he thinks she plays beautifully. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. Art is subjective. But he finds himself going out, and he finds himself really quite outraged that she would be treated with such disrespect from these three, perverts, these three young jerks. And he starts conjuring this revenge fantasy, quite frankly, where he would, cast them out, and he would save her, and she would be so grateful to him, Gregor, for appreciating her art. And there would be this grand, almost big R romantic scene between them, where they would be devoted to one another, despite all of their obstacles of him being a bug. And it's a little creepy. It has that somewhat questionable feel to it, but at the same time, it's important, I think, that he is responding to art. He is responding to the music. He's drawn out by that more than anything. And he questions himself, was he a beast that music so moved him? Bugs don't necessarily like music. It's speaking to an element of his humanity that hasn't been crushed yet, an element of his identity that remains. He's not fully bestial. He can respond to art, to beauty, and that's him. that is something about him, not a bug, that he's showing right there, which up until this point has been a slow wearing away of the human until this last little vestige that he realizes, I'm not all gone. I'm still a human being capable of feeling, of admiration, of love, of aspiration to something better and more perfect. He felt as if he were being shown the way to that unknown nourishment he craved. He hasn't been getting any nourishment for a long time now. That unknown nourishment. He has been denying his self, been denying his particular identity, slaving away for years at a job he does not like, trying to support his family and earn their love. And it has been slowly withdrawing from him because they say that it's become more like a transaction, that he's just the meal ticket. He goes out, he does the work, he comes home, he pays the bills. And he wants something more beautiful than that, something more authentic. And he's just realizing that he can still have that, or he can still want that, or know that. Who among us is always perfectly fulfilled? But we know when we're not. And that feeling can be vivifying. It reminds us we're human. And yet there is that somewhat pervy sense to him as well, because he's imagining, as he's making this little internal monologue about how he's going to send her to school and she's going to be so appreciative. After this declaration, his sister would be moved to the point of tears, and Gregor would raise himself to the height of her armpit and kiss her throat, which, now that she went to the office every day, financially productive, she wore free of ribbon or collar. Which, ribbons and collars on the throat today, not so much of a thing, but a naked throat? And, who kisses their sister on the throat? That's oddly sexual. Of course, all this time he is crawling out into the living room where the concert is going on, and all of a sudden the lodgers say, and it's a bit of a horror show at that point. They're outraged, justifiably so. The family tries to shush them out of the way and get Gregor back in his room, and like, no, nothing to see here, Go back, go ahead. Everything's fine. Just let's all take a break. They are somewhat, outraged. Again, I would say justifiably so, that there is this giant bug living in the apartment with them. They threaten to, we're going to leave at once, and we're not paying for anything, which ups the consequences a little bit for Gregor's action, and signals that, well, okay, if this gets out, this is before you could write reviews on Airbnb or Yelp or something like that, and give a critical opinion. Warning: your apartment will have a giant bug in it. It points out the financial unworkability of this arrangement that they think they have. They can't have lodgers in, and clearly they would only do that if it was the only way to really make ends meet. They cannot do that with Gregor there. Something has to change. And this is the dawning realization of this moment. And, you know, they get the lodgers in the room. They don't leave right away. Maybe they're bluffing on that whole, oh, I'm outraged. And they were just kind of looking for an excuse to not pay the rent, because there's a little mention in there that one of them had a rather threadbare coat. Like, you know, all right, beggars can't be choosers. But it's the sister who has been Gregor's, who began as Gregor's greatest champion, the only one who really helped them throughout, but whose attention and frustration have been progressing. The attention to him has been sort of waning. Her irritation has been waxing, and we are clearly at a breaking point. Maybe there is, you know, maybe she reacts out of the frustration of potential romantic interest. Maybe she was interested in one of the lodgers. I kind of find that hard to believe, but, you know, this is the first time that perhaps a group of young men have paid her any attention, and her brother comes and screws it up. Maybe there's that there, I'm not sure. But what is clear is that for her, this is the last straw. And she says very dramatically, and really in a very painful way, I am unwilling to utter my brother's name before this creature, and therefore will say only, we have to try to get rid of it. Get rid of it. Which is a harsh thing to say about anything, let alone your brother. Calling him an it and just saying that it's something that you have to get rid of, that's like mafia talk. She commands also in this moment. She basically calls the shots for the family. The mom is kind of dithering. She's forever like, you know, getting hysterical and fainting and falling asleep or something. The father is initially rather soft to the idea, and she says, child. Her father said sympathetically and with noticeable compassion, but what can we do? Which is it's a soft reaction to that. You know, what can we do? It's a weak reaction, arguably. It's a compassionate reaction also, because this is his son we're talking about. You know, what can we do? We can't just kill him. And specifically, he identifies her as child at this moment. But she is firm. She is strong. She is decisive. She has taken over the power of the family at this point. She is calling the shots, and she says, no, we have to get rid of it. And the father is hedging on that, but then he qualifies it a little bit. Well, if he understood us, Gregor's father said, half questioning. His sister, still caught up with her weakings, shook one hand vehemently as a sign of how unthinkable she found this. Thinking about killing themselves. If he understood us, his father repeated, closing his eyes to absorb the conviction that this was utterly out of the question, then it might be possible to come to an agreement with him. It's a question here of they want to know how much reason, how much of his mental faculties are still in there. Gregor can't talk at all. He has no expressive powers at all. But they're wondering, does he have consciousness in a human recognizable form? Can they just tell him, you have to go, and he'll go? Do they have to do it themselves? It's a question. But Gregor's sister isn't necessarily having any of it. Greta screams out, it has to go. Again, punching that it. It has to go. Which is the strongest declaration she's made so far. It's not, we have to try to get rid of it at this point. It is, it has to go. Which again, casts agency on Gregor, but still, she's laying down the law. She is calling the shots. She is the head of the family now. She is 17 years old. She is asserting herself. And Gregor somehow gets shuffled back into his room, and he looks around, and he doesn't even understand how he's moving at all. And then he can't. His little legs no longer function. And he says, it struck him as unnatural that he had actually until now been able to support himself on those thin little legs. So he's objectifying himself. He's alienated from his physical self entirely now. It's like, oh, it's absurd that I, as a bug, could walk around on those legs. Those tiny little legs. He's outside of his body now. He's dying. He feels the numbness on his back where the rotting apple was. Everything is weak, and you get the sense that he doesn't really feel anything anymore. He's just disappearing. And then he's gone. He just sort of drifts off. Gone. The housekeeper comes in the next morning, opens the door, goes into like clean up, do whatever her duties are, and you just sort of see, you know, she wonders if he's playing a trick on her, just lying there perfectly still in the middle of the floor. You know, it says she considered him perfectly capable of rational thought. Of course, which is hysterical, but you know. And then she realizes, well, no, he's gone. And she calls out to the family, you know, come have a look, he's gone and croaked, just lying there dead as a doornail. It's a little brusque, charming. It's a nice little moment of comic relief after the big death scene. The family comes running in. The mom is in her night dress. Again, always sort of linked to underwear and lingerie. I don't know. And they accept it. They deal with it. It's a loss, but it's one they, you know, have made up their minds about. The lodgers come out. They've been sleeping there all night, and the father just leave my house at once. Just done with it. Because they come out, they're asking for, hey, where's breakfast? Like nothing happened. They've already said they're not going to pay for anything, but they expect breakfast, and they and Mr. Sampson, Gregor's dad, just leave my house at once. And you get the sense of, again, the full strength of the man is back. And he is commanding the family in this moment. And the sister and the mother are sort of flanking him. They're clinging to him. And the family unit is unified in supporting him, but also throwing out the lodgers, the loafs. They sit down, they write letters to their bosses. Each one of them has a job, each one of them has responsibilities, each one of them has some place to go that morning. But they each write a letter saying, you know, under the circumstances, due to the loss of the family, I will not be in today, yada, 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 yada. The housekeeper comes up and says, well, you know, I took care of it for you. I got rid of it. She cleaned up the body and did something with it. We don't know what. I don't really want to know. They don't want to know either, evidently. She kind of goes off, and the family, you know, says, well, okay, tomorrow we're going to fire her. They recognize that, well, maybe it's just silly for us to have a housekeeper. They start talking about, well, let's get a new apartment, maybe something a little bit more modest, something smaller and cheaper that we can manage. They are becoming independent. They're going to support themselves now. They no longer have Gregor or Gregor's expectations to deal with, so they are free to go and carve out their lives as they can. And they go for a little ride into the country just to go see it. We're told that this is the end of March, which is springtime, which is rebirth, which is flowering, which is all of this stuff. And they go for this little ride into the country. And they go wandering around. And Gregor's parents, Greta's parents, notice her. And they look at her like, hey, wow, I hadn't noticed that before. Observing their daughter, who was growing ever more vivacious. Oh, that's a word. By the thought that despite all the torments that had made her cheeks grow pale, she had recently blossomed into a beautiful, voluptuous girl. Voluptuous. Growing quieter now and communicating with one another, and unconsciously by an exchange of glances, they thought about how it would soon be time for her to find a good husband. Mom and Dad are just sort of looking at us like, yeah, she's gonna catch an eye really soon. She's about 17 now. It's time. She has grown up. And when they arrived at their destination, it seemed to them almost a confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when their daughter sprang swiftly sprang to her feet and stretched her young body. And that's the end. Beginnings and endings. Why end on that? The image of her stretching her young body. A clearly sexualized image. But also significantly one of growth. Stretched her young body. Stretching is growing. She has changed. She has developed. She has grown throughout this process. They all have. The father has refound his dignity in work. The mother has become somewhat financially independent as well and been able to deal with some crises along the way. Greta has grown up. She has started to work. She is perhaps giving up on her dreams of being in the conservatory. She is looking towards a better position in her career through a stenography class, and she has blossomed sexually. She attracted the suitors, or not the suitors, the lodgers. She is suddenly, you know, somewhat voluptuous enough that her family, her parents are looking at her like, wow. She has changed. They have all changed. And of course, the word change, or another word for the word change, is metamorphosis. So it's not just Gregor who changed. It begins with him changing, but it's the entire family that is different at the end. He becomes a bug and descends. They go from whatever status they were at initially, and maybe the father was somewhat bug-like in his psychology for those 5 years after his business failed. but he starts to grow and develop and regain his strength throughout. So that clearly, in a zero-sum calculation, Gregor has to die so the father can rise. His rebirth is predicated on Gregor's destruction. Is that how it is in families? Is that really what Kafka meant? I don't know. But I think there is a real psychological dynamic to that at the time was in the air, especially in Eastern Europe and the Germanic states, let's say, because of Freud. This was being talked about. This was being noodled around in literary and scientific journals of the time, and people were considering these things. Not in the full expression that Kafka gives it. Kafka obviously doesn't go the scientific route. Kafka is clearly dealing with a full artistic and aesthetic vision here of a somewhat surrealistic, somewhat expressionistic, in that it is intensely felt. Every moment of this is intensely felt. It is somewhat bizarrely dislocated. There's no specific setting or time, or the hazy outlines are very indistinct. You have no idea really what city this is or what year this is. It's all so hallucinatory rather. But through this, you get a sense of a mind extraordinarily closed in and yet bursting with energy. So you get all of these images getting tossed out of the subconscious, as Freud would call it, but it is a passionate expression of deeply held emotion and psychosis and the tortured perception of the world as it is for this one individual. The individual here is clearly Kafka. The story never breaks from that third-person perspective. It'll go inside characters' minds. It's a third-person omniscient, but it sticks very closely to third person. And remember, even if the beginning seems so close as it's describing waking up and feeling like a bug, so close to Gregor's perception, he dies a few pages before the end of the book, and all that stuff about the family coming to terms and then taking the ride into the country, that's all after he's dead, so he's not telling that part of the story. It is through Kafka's mind. He makes himself a kind of character in this. Now maybe it is him, the narrator, let's try and stay away from the author. The narrator goes through a metamorphosis in that he comes to see the truth of families and that he has to deal with that so that he can approach his own family, perhaps. I don't know. But there is that warped and somewhat omnipresent narrative voice throughout, that perception throughout that is guiding everything. We're not invited to draw too many conclusions on our own about the reality. We are sucked into the consciousness, the perspective of the narrator, and we have to negotiate on those terms. This is much like the German expressionist art that was flourishing at the time. This is much like the surrealist art that was flourishing as well. There is a sense of deep foreboding in this. If this is a psychosis that is present in the world at that time, in that particular place, you can see a kind of tortured psychological sociopathy that a lot of critics will point to and say, well, yeah, that's the beginning of Nazism. It's that sense of oppression, that sense of being overwhelmed and struggling for your own identity. People will see that very frankly in historical terms and say, well, okay, yes, this is the German state writ large as it marches towards Nazism. Others will see and say, well, okay, no, this is actually, Kafka was a Jew, so this is the perception of the Jewish population within Germany feeling oppressed by that. People will also look at this and say, well, no, it has nothing to do with that. This is clearly a story of Gregor Samsa, dealing with homosexuality at the time and feeling social pressures about that and the dynamics within the family and the self-loathing and all of that. It is there is no answer to this. Should we view Gregor primarily as a Jew in a repressive society? Should we see him somehow as a proto-Nazi who is going to become ever more bestial as time goes on? Is he an artist who is oppressed and unappreciated? There is all of this in this story that has no answer. Many people offer answers. They don't really know. The fun part, however, is just to jump in and try and draw your own conclusion. Try and come up with an idea that you can defend, that doesn't ignore whole chunks of the book, and that makes the story more interesting to you. One of the reasons this is such a popular book over the course of a century now is that it's very memorable. That, that first story of, one morning he woke up after difficult dreams and found himself to be a giant insect. It invites people in. There's a curiosity to it. There's a power to it that is, frankly, quite seductive. Everybody can get this book. It's not it's not a particularly difficult one. It has a lot of unanswered questions, so it's difficult to come up with, well, this is what it means. You're not going to get that. But dealing with all the elements, making meaning out of it, is actually fairly easy if you just start to add things up in different ways. There is no right answer, but going back and forth between the wrong answers, that's part of the fun. And Kafka, while he is not necessarily, laugh out loud funny at all times, little moments here and there, he is definitely funny. And funny and fun, if you like that kind of thing.